Shavua Tov. I'd like to discuss with you some of the insights of the Likutei Halochos, which I got to learn over Shabbos for Parshas Mishpatim. It begins with an analysis of the symbolic meaning of keeping an Eved for 6 years and freeing him on the seventh year. He says that an Eved represents someone who's part of this physical, material, limited world to a very extreme extent. He's completely imprisoned by Zman, by time. We know that time is responsible for the disintegration of every matter. Everything that exists will disintegrate over time. And we ourselves are passing through this life until we have to leave, and we are in such a way that tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in its petty pace, as Shakespeare says. So we are prisoners of time. Time represents that element in the human experience, which reflects on his limited physical finiteness. And the Eved is an extreme example of that. And we give the Eved 6 years. And during this 6 years, hopefully, he is involved in a process of rectifying himself, freeing himself from Zman, from the shackles of time, to reach higher spiritual levels, coming closer to the infinite. And that's what our Avod is all about. And based on this, we can understand perhaps why we free him on the seventh year. There, Bnei Yisrael, he says, are excluded from Avdus in the very essence. Avdus, slavery, and being a Jew in its essence, these two are mutually exclusive. That's what the Pasuk says, Ki li b'nei Yisrael avodim, avodehem v'lo avodim v'lo avodim. The entire enterprise of Yetzias Mitzrayim is to remove us, free us from slavery in the psychological sense of the term. V'zeh, and this individual, nafal lebchinas avdus, he fell back as a throwback to the avdus of before Mitzrayim. Machmas godol chisaron daito v'nafal tachas hazman. He came under the influences of things that are temporal, are physical, are material, are zman-oriented. And therefore, at shemochar atzmo li eved, he either sold himself as an eved, or perhaps he was guilty of theft, and he was sold by the bezdin. But tzrichim l'rachem olav, we have to give him an element of compassion and mercy, because 6 years, year after year, he's slavering. It's having an impact on his soul. Will give him 6 years of slavery, kineged, that corresponds to Sheshis Yimei HaMaaseh, the 6 days of every week, which are dedicated to physical work and labor. Aval b'Shvius, that's the Bechin of Shabbos. Yetzei lachafshi, he goes free for the 7th year, the year of Shabbos. Ki Shabbos Yimei Ein Olam Haba. Shabbos is above the shackles, the limitations of time. It belongs to a different world. He bechinas lamala me'asman. And therefore, we have to have compassion on him and free him for the 7th year, keneged the Shabbos. And it's interesting that during Shabbos, we reach a level of faith, of emunah, of clarity, of vision of the divine, Leda, and we realize on Shabbos, because anyone who comes closer to the spiritual world experiences anava, humility. Rechokim, we realize how far we are from chachma, and we mechazek oneself the emunah shlema, with total emunah, faith. We come closer to Hashem. That's the neshama of Shabbos. And Yachol Kol Echad Lizkos Ubchinas Bittul Azman. Shabbos really represents, in its very essence, the antithesis of time. It's me'ein olam haba. And this gives us the ability, even in this world, to be mavakel, the whole concept and our relationship to Zman. And mirachok, although we might be distant, but nevertheless on a roam mevinim we get a taste. Ein lizman shum mamish. There's something that is an infinite experience, a divine experience, and there's no impact at all of time. And all this is al yidei chizuk emunah nimchach mishabes. This strengthens our faith, and this is a result, the impact of Shabbos on our soul. And therefore, as a result, we should be merachem and give freedom to the Eved on year number 7. How bad is the pagam, the negative element that brought this person to the state of avdus? It's pretty bad. Because zeshe mochers atzmoli Eved gomer pagam mi'od ma'od. He says this is a real desecration of the sanctity of man. Our teachers, our Rabbeinu Amru, Ozen Shamal Har Sinai Ki Li B'nei Yisrael Avodim, that we are servants only to the Lord, only to God. V'holach v'kona adon li'atzmo, and he sold himself as an eved, accepting upon himself a human master. He says that this is so antithetical to what, as we mentioned earlier, Yetzias Mitzrayim is all about. And Yetzias Mitzrayim is all about lattes, to break away from Bechinas Avdus. And by doing so, it's a Kabbalah's old Torah. Torah is cherus, is freedom. And when we break away from slavery through the Torah that we accept, we are now cherus al Halochos. Chazal say, al tikri charis al Halochos, ella cherus al Halochos. When a person frees himself, that true definition of existential freedom is something that we achieved cherus ola. And our very essences was transformed, each and every one of us. And therefore, that is the Iker Kabbalah Satorah. And now, Lefi Nefilaso, this unfortunate Jew who has fallen, and he's in a state of Yigios and Avdus and Tirchos. He's very much involved in all the vicissitudes, the limitations, the finite tensions and pressures, psychological pressures of life, of work. Until he got to the point, Nimkali Evet. That's the level of Avdus. And now we can answer a question. The Torah says, right here at the beginning of Mishpatim, that the master is able to give to this Eved, im Adonov Yitin Lo Isha. This Isha is none other than a Shivcha. Now we're enjoined from having a relationship with a Shivcha under a Lav Doraisa of Osea Kedesha, of Kedeshus. And this person, who is a Jew, but he's an Eved, got to the point in which the Torah allows him to be married to a Shivcha, which normally would be a very severe Isur. He goes on and describes the severity of the Isur in great detail. He says that Chazal derived from the pasuk Begapo Yava Begapo Yetze in Bali Chahu, that this ability and this permission, allowing the Adon to give the slave a shivcha, only applies to a married Eved. In other words, he's been married in the past in a beautiful marriage of Bas Yisrael Zivug Kosher. If he's a single fellow who's never married, we're not allowed to give him a shivcha. And the answer is that Afal Pisha Yisa Shivcha, if he's a married man and he has this relationship with a shivcha, nevertheless, Kfar Nischaber B'Kedusha, he is already linked up to holiness. Al Yidei Bas Zugo HaKshera. And the Isha, as we see in Mishlei, represents Yiras Hashem. Isha, Yiras Hashem, Mitzvah Hala. So he's already had that very powerful dosage of Yiras Hashem in the context of his first marriage, of his marriage, current marriage with his wife, who is a Bas Yisrael, Kshera, Yirei Shamayim. He's got that penetrating into his soul. Therefore, the Torah has faith that Afal Pi, Sheyisa Shivcha, Yesh Tikva. The Torah holds out hope. He's already experienced, he's connected to Kedusha. He's sanctity. However, Elo Isha, if he's not married, Begapo Yetze, in other words, he's not going to get a Shivcha. That's also. Also, Limsalo Shivcha Penye Nevad Legamre. He's on such a level that you can imagine that an intimate relationship with a Shivcha, that's going to just be the final straw that breaks, that breaks the camel's back. And again, moving on in the Parshas, just give you a little bit of a taste of how to understand concepts in the Torah, both literally and metaphorically. Here the Torah says, "Ki yatsuch anoshim." There's a battle, a physical boxing match between two men. And nogfu isha hara. There was a pregnant woman, and never she got a clap. He didn't mean to hit her necessarily, but as a result, yatsu yoladem. The Chizkuni, when he speaks about the loss of the fetus as a result of this, he speaks about a nefel. A nefel is a halachic term that refers to a preemie that unfortunately was born so premature that the infant, or shall we call it the embryo, was not able to survive. What is the metaphor or the symbol represented by a nefel? He says, a person takes upon himself a great enterprise, a commitment to a new challenge with a new philosophy, a new ideology. He decides he's going to be the prime minister. He says, be very careful. Why? Are you well thought out? Are you experienced? Have you done your research? Is it the right moment? Don't go jumping out and prematurely approach and implement this beautiful, brilliant idea that you have, this very innovative revolution. Let it simmer down. It's true if you know a little bit about the Gera Hasidim or the Kotzker Rebbe. They were by nature very quiet. They didn't go out there yelling and screaming. To get a word out of the Kotzker Rebbe was a big deal. Don't always push. Wait until something cooks and then it explodes. It boils over. You have to wait for the right moment. If you don't, then it's going to be a nefel. And it's very interesting because what is the opening of this parasha? Ki notzu anoshim yachto. What is the symbolic message of this battle between the two people? And how does it connect to the nefel concept? And from what I understand, the answer to that question is that ki notzu, what brings about this tremendous battle between two people? It's really a conflict of minds, of ideologies. It's a result of competition where each individual thinks he's going to wave his flag, he has the right approach, his ideology is the correct one. So above and beyond the physical elements of this parasha, in terms of a battle between two men, Reuven and Shimon are at each other's, the feathers are flying in this very great battle. The symbolism is the terrible impact of competition. And perhaps that competition is really extremely severe in the case of a young person who has his ideology. He knows what's right and what the world needs. He's got an innovative chachma, a wisdom, but he's not yet ripe, and he's pushing it. It's not the right moment. This could lead to such a undue and severe competition that it leads to a nafel situation. But the Torah says there are two possibilities. True, the nafel is going to die, that's sure. But what about the mother? Will she survive? And the Torah gives two alternative scenarios. In the metaphor, the nimshal, as we call it, in one case is nafel dies prematurely. But the etam chachma, the wisdom, the inspiration, the vision that he has to be creative, that survives. And that's the persona of the Isha, the mother of these Nebuchadnezzar that died. She's still around. Find the right moment. And if you won't be able to bring her to the state of pregnancy, another person will. And there's still a possibility that the chachma that you brought into this world will eventually take seed, take root. But if it's really severe and you have completely prematurely presented your derech, your approach, then it could be that she will die, which means even the chachma itself, the vision, the wisdom, the impetus, the emotional push, all that will go down the tube. And that is represented symbolically by her death. We have the parsha here of the Ganav, the thief, Chayav, Chaim Shnayim Yisham. He's got to pay kefel. What is this kefel all about? What does it represent? The Likutei Halochos presents a thesis, and again, I'm giving it to you in my words, the way I understand it, that the payment that the Ganav is paying is part of a process of tshuva. And the penalty that we're imposing upon him is meant to bring him to a higher state in which he will leave his former lifestyle as a thief and take on more spiritual and high motivations and goals. And what is this whole parsha of Neva all about on a symbolic level, metaphorically? He says the Ganav here represents the Yetzer Hara. He calls it by its Kabbalistic term, the Sitra Achra. V'hu orev al ha'adam b'chol eis v'ganav mam. She's really a thief that is waiting to come out of the shadows and jump and pounce upon him. V'holech im ha'adam, and how does he get man to trip up and to violate the Torah? With kol binei hatayos v'ramos unecholim v'armumios, all sorts of, he induces him, he tricks him, he misguides him, and he's a marov, he's like an ambush, ready to pounce upon him. And therefore, we certainly could see how the Sitra Achra is called a Ganav. He is tricking you, and he's stealing from you your opportunities. And he takes them, which they themselves have kedusha, have sanctity, and he grabs them into his storage house, so to speak. Every Ganav has a place where he hides the loot. And the Sitra Achra has almost these klipos, these non-kosher and contaminated sort of ruach, and he surrounds them and he encompasses them, and he's really holding on to that which is yours. Those attributes and those propensities that God bequeathed of you to seek out the good and the holy, and he's holding on to them. He's the thief. When you battle against this thief, you could do it on one level, which is called Keren in the Mashal, or on a higher level, which is called Kefa. You could go for the top, go for broke. How so? One thing you could do is free that which was stolen, the Keren itself, and retrieve and reclaim that which is rightfully yours. But you know what? That doesn't guarantee you, by paying the Keren, when you get back that which is yours, that this Ganav is not going to come back after you again. Pay him twice. What happens now is that in the process of tshuva, you can actually break the power of the Yetzer Hara, of the Sitra, such that he won't come back and fight against you a second time. And again, I'm just giving you little scratching the surface level of some of the symbolic messages here in this parasha. The Torah tells us here in Parshas Shmos, Parshas Mishpatim of Shmos, that we're not allowed to mix meat and milk. Can't cook it together. We can't eat that combination. I mean, this is so much part of the life and behavior, the psyche of a religious person. Milchix, Fleischix, what are you? 6 hours. And throughout the generations, many commentaries have tried to explain what is the deeper meaning here. It seems irrational. And the Gemara in Chulin calls it, we're allowed to eat the meat, it's got a kosher shchita. We're allowed to eat the milk, it came from a kosher animal. Why can't we mix the two? It's irrational. It's exeris hakos. But those who have attempted to find and discover Tamei HaMitzvahs suggest the following. The idea of the animal and the meat thereof is one symbolism that reflects on a certain polar extreme. On the other polar extreme is the chalav imo, the milk. What is the symbolic meaning of the meat? The Torah calls it gedi. Gedi is a young goat. A goat is called an aiz. And the Torah gives us in all midos the challenge to either use it for good or the opposite. And a perfect example is the midah of azut. Azut means, if it's used in the right way, that I stand for what is right. I don't budge. I'm not willing to give up and yield on my principles. I am totally dedicated and committed to it. But azut, if it's used in the wrong way, instead of being kedusha, it could be just the opposite. It's not something that's holy and sanctified. It is a corruption of that very same midah of azut. The aiz, the goat, is symbolic of that wildness, of that it's got to be my way, and the aggressive nature of that azut, as the Mishnah in Avos speaks about. And chalav, on the other hand, the milk, in this case, chalav imo. The Torah doesn't mention milk, even though any milk of any kosher animal, but imo. The emphasis here is on the meat of an aim, of a woman, which represents the meat of kol kvoda basmel pnima, of humility, of modesty, of a certain kind of, if you would call it, a weakness. And once again, it could go in one of two ways. It could be used for good, for kedusha. As we say, modesty is wonderful. Or sometimes if a person is too meek, when he really should be out there pulling and pushing for an ideal, then chalav imo turns sour, so to speak. And now the question is, in these two polar extremes, we want each midah to be studied on its own. Investigate, introspect. Where are you on this scale? Are you an aiz that is wild, untamed, aggressive, or are you using that midah, that same midah of azus, for something positive? Don't mix it together with the cholov, with the milk. Take each midah on its own, separate. Investigate whether you are living up to the moral demands, the vision that the Torah has set for you, to take that midah and use it well. Don't start combining it. These are two polar extremes that shouldn't be mixed. By the way, he has another explanation which is even more fascinating, but we'll give that on another occasion. And finally, to finish up our themes for today, time is late. The Torah says, Ki tir'ech hamor son'acha. You see the beast of burden of your enemy. And rovetz tachas maso, the burden is too much for the animal is collapsing. Azov tazov himo. Help pick up, lift up the animal. Chazal tell us that sonacha. What does it mean, your enemy? How could you have an enemy, a Jew? You can't hate a Jew. Sha'avar avera, he did something terrible. And you may have been personally impacted by it, or you witnessed it. Rovetz tachas maso, what is the message, metaphorically, that this beast cannot hold that burden? It's the burden of the sin. It's too heavy. He is collapsing because of masoy avonot, because of his carrying of the sins. Ve'im kein yalal daitcha, you are witnessing a person who is crushed by his sins. And you entertain the ability, lachdo me'asov, I'm not going to help him out. Ki nidmelecha shekosha la'losa. There's no way that you can extricate this person from the evil that he's involved in. But the message of this parsha is that you may have given up hope on him. Aval Hashem yitzbach racham b'chanim. V'hizir b'rachmav, in God's compassion. Azov tazov imo. V'afilu nefesh kazos. Even such a person who is collapsing under the weight of his sins. Tzrichim lazor l'shtadel b'chol kocho lagbio ula'alosa. And God is guaranteeing that even such a person is within reason. He hasn't crossed all red lines. And if we show him the love and the compassion and we help him up, we can indeed get him to the point where he can stand on his own 2 feet. Yiratzon, that we be able to learn the Torah and these beautiful ideas that are deep in the remez HaTorah, shivim parim HaTorah, below the surface. And we can take these ideals and have them inspire us to greater avoda, to serve Hashem with emunah, with tefillah on the highest level. Kein Yiratzon. Amen. Thank you very much, and Shavua.